grandkids, how are you? Back to the stories of Grandfucker. There's some fun ones. There's some adventures. Okay. So when my dad was working in the school year, he would drive the school bus each morning with all his kids his age, a lot of kids his age, drive him to school, and it was quite a long drive. I think it was like 15 miles or so, and to Panaca. And then he'd go to school with them, and then in the evening he'd go to J.C. Penney's store, and he would work till about 10 or 11, restocking shelves, putting things on the shelves and sweeping. And so he said he was really tired in the morning because he'd get up and have to be early and go pick up the school kids again in the bus. And he would do that in the winter and the fall and spring. Then in the summer, he was able to do different work. And one of the jobs he and his father did would be to go up into the mountains and cut down big trees and logs. And he would throw them up on this great big, over this huge wall of a truck that they had built. So I'm going to show you. He said he used a 12-pound sledgehammer. Here's the 12-pound sledgehammer. I looked one up from the 1930s. And then he would use these wedges. And they'd put these wedges in the tree and then hit it with this great big sledgehammer, and it would split the wood. So those were wedges they'd hammer those into the logs, and it would split the wood. So the wood would burn better or be able to use it for building. And he said it was really hard work. And they would work all day long. And he said they'd have to throw these huge logs up over the sides of this truck that they had built, these big sides of the truck to hold the wood, up to 8 to 10 feet. So it took all the strength he had to throw these up over that. And it would strain, it'd be so much strain. And he said he would often see stars. You know how when you do something really hard, you'll sometimes see stars and almost black out? He said that happened to him a lot. He would almost black out and he'd see those stars because it was so hard. It took every bit of umph and grunt and strain to throw those logs that high. And he said, I don't know how we ever did it. He said it was so hard, and he would do it all day long. And then they'd drive the truck home, and they would stack it in these long, tall, high piles. And he said, I don't know how we ever did it or why I ever did it, except for the love of my wonderful dad and mother and my small brother and sisters. And he said that love for them helped him to work so hard because his dad had this cancer in his stomach and he wasn't very strong and couldn't do very much and couldn't earn a living. It was hard for him to make the money. And so my dad took that on. He was the oldest son and he did a lot of work to help put food on the table. And so he said then one time he had to drive to Cedar City and make a delivery of some sort. So he drove 100 miles and it was a long ways, and he didn't get home that night until 1 a.m. And when he pulled into town, he was really tired, and their house at this time, so they had lived in the cave, if you remember, when they first moved to Caliani. Then they bought a little basement house that was underground. None of the house came above the ground. And it was just kind of this old little dark basement that they moved into. And when he got there, he went down the stairs and he had a flashlight and it was really dark. And he said the whole room was almost filled with water. It was like a swimming pool. And he said their fridge was floating and all their furniture was floating. And he was so terrified when he saw this. He didn't know if his family had drowned. And someone came at that time and said to him, a neighbor, and said, hey, Wilford, there's been the worst flood in Caliani history. And it came down this huge wash, much bigger than this. He said it was 40 feet deep and 50 feet across. And so much deeper and bigger than this was just, it was usually dry, but it had this huge flood of water that it said came out of the mountain and came down that and flooded his family's house. But they were all safe. They were at a neighbor's, but they said it was really hard to get out of the house. They said their beds started just swirling with water, just all around it. Can you imagine in the middle of the night, all of a sudden water's just swirling around? And then they tried to get up and climb up the stairs to get out of their basement, a basement house. They said the water was pouring in with such force, they could hardly get past this water to get out of the house. It was really a dangerous situation. But my dad was so frightened when he came home to that. But he said one of the hard, sad parts of this whole thing was all of that wood that he'd spent the entire summer chopping down and working on. The whole thing had washed away. And that represented a lot of what they would live on. So that was really hard. I'm going to show you a picture. I have the exact picture of it. Let's see. Oh, I got to turn this around, huh? See if I can do it. Oh, here we go. Okay, I don't know if you can see it, but this is the wood pile, and that is either my dad or grandpa standing by it. He said it was about 60 feet long, and it was like 15 to 20 feet tall. And so that was really a hard thing for him to see all that work washed away. But he said that didn't really mean anything compared to that his family was safe. He was just so grateful that his family was safe. I hope you could see that, because that was a really big wood pile. But anyway, so all that money was washed away, and that was to help support his family. And that was a whole summer, all of May, all of June, all of July, all of August, that whole summer just gone. All the money that he would have earned, that he was blacking out because it was so hard, such hard work. And then he told about, he said, we were building a new home up on Spring Heights. And he said there was a man that was selling these 2 old little box apartments for very reasonable. And my grandpa and my dad decided, hey, let's buy these and we'll use this to make our new house. These 2 old apartments, and they'll redo them and move them onto their lot. And so that's what they did. They had to, first of all, dig the hole. And this is what they used to dig the hole. They used this big scoop shovel, and he called it a Fresno scoop. And you would hook it onto their truck, and you would pull it, and one would use their hands and one would tow it with the truck, and they'd get as much dirt as they could. And that's how he made his whole basement and leveled the yard. And he said it took thousands of scoops. It was so much work. And he said it took thousands of hours and thousands of scoops to get that dugout hole for their basement. And then they were able to lay a foundation of concrete. And then they put those 2 apartments on. And he said if they wouldn't have used those apartments, it would have been so much easier. It was so much more work. But they put those apartments on. They put black paper on the outside of it, like a tar, and then like a chicken wire on it. And then my grandpa, Mortimer Willis, he went and plastered the whole house. And my dad said it was one of the prettiest houses in town. It was beautiful how he plastered these beautiful arches. So my grandpa Willis, I'm going to show you a picture of that house he plastered. And okay, there is the house. There it is, right there. I hope you can see it. My mom and dad, when they were older, are standing in front of it. So that's the house he helped build. And then my brother Bob in this picture is holding on a hook that is inside the house, that is up on the ceiling. And that hook was what they hung a bouncer saucer that he jumped in when he was a baby. So that was kind of a funny story. Okay, so they helped build this house, and it was beautiful. And in the upstairs, it had 2 bedrooms. This felt really big. 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, a kitchen, and a living room. And it felt really nice and spacious, and had that nice porch with the beautiful arches. And then in the basement, they had 3 bedrooms on one side, 3 bedrooms on the other, and they rented them out. They rented these rooms out, and they would feed them their food and give them these rooms, and that's how they helped make a living. So that was kind of a fun, neat story too. And he said, and then he said he had the opportunity to buy another car. This is an old one, and it's called a Chandler. So I got a picture of a 1930 Chandler, and my dad bought a car, and he said it was so classy, and he said it had the most soft cushions inside there, and he said it had air springs that were amazing and shock absorbers that made it so much better, and it even had 4 doors, and that made it so luxurious and so fancy, and he loved it. But his was green, and he just loved it. And he said, so he bought that, and then he eventually bought the first Harley Davidson in Caliani. And this is a 1930s Harley Davidson motorcycle. And I don't know what color his was or what it looked like, but that could have been partially what it looked like. And he said he loved it, and he would take his friends on rides up the canyon and all over the place. He would take girls and boys, and he said they had the best times. And he said he never had any serious accidents, but he did say sometimes coming around the corners, if there was gravel on the road, it would be like ice, and he would slide. And he says he beat up his knees and his elbows pretty good. And then he said his dad got a contract to deliver sand for a huge project, and they were going to build some bridges and big tunnels, culverts for water, and they didn't have big machinery in that day, and so it was mostly by hand. So if you didn't have these big scoop shovel trucks, and so you did it with a shovel. So my dad and my grandpa had to shovel sand for this huge project in Alamo, which was 20 or 30 miles away. So they would drive out to this sand area, and they would shovel, and they had what he called a gravity dump bed truck. So you know the big dump trucks? This is a gravity one that some way used gravity to do its dumping. And so he said they could hold about 3 yards of sand on this truck. So I'm going to show it to you. So here's one I looked up from the 1930s, a gravity dump truck. And he said they would take a shovel and they would shovel over the side. And this was another one that he would work 16 hours a day, he said, on this. He and his dad. And his dad wasn't very strong or very healthy, so it was really hard on him. So my dad worked really hard to be able to do this because he was young, and he said it was really, really hard work. And he said, and they would make concrete with all the sand. So he would drive the 20 miles or whatever it was. And he said there was a really steep hill on part of this that was so slow. He only could go in first gear. It was so slow for him to get up this big hill, 15-mile long hill. And he said, even when I was energetic and fresh, it was really hard to drive. It was so exhausting in that low gear, all of that sand. But he would make these one after another, these trips. And he would shovel all day long and have to throw it up over the side. And he said you had to throw it up about 7 to 9 feet over the side that they had built on the truck. And then you had to screen all the sand through a sieve to make it fine. And so they had to shovel, screen, and haul it to this place. And he said one time he had to do it alone. His dad couldn't help him for 3 days. So for 3 days and 2 nights, my dad never slept. And he said he ate very little. And he just kept working the whole day, doing the shoveling, the sifting, and then driving. And he said one time, he said I had been going from night to day, and he said it was really, he said I could hardly take time to eat for 3 days and 2 nights. After working all night and a day, and on the second night, in the middle of the night, I was on a slow stretch of road. I don't even remember running off the road, and running off the road didn't even wake me up. He said, even though I was nearly to tip over when he woke up, he was in the truck, it was all ready to tip over. And he goes, it's really a wonder I didn't. But he says, when I woke up, the sun was shining in my eyes and the truck was just like ready to tip over. And he says, but I was feeling so much better. I'd got some sleep. And he says, but I must not have slept very long because the lights were still on the truck. And I was afraid the battery would be dead, but he said by hand cranking it, so you had to hand crank to start your vehicles in that day. And he says he was able to get enough spark to start the car with the hand crank. So he didn't think he'd been asleep too long because the lights were still on. But he said from that job, working so hard, and I don't know if that was the whole summer, but it was a long time. He said he was able to buy a $600 car for his family. I'm trying to get to it. And it was called, it was a sparkling new Oldsmobile. And I got a picture of an Oldsmobile from the 1930s. And that was a really nice car for their family. And he said that he would take all of his friends in that to Ash Springs. Do you remember the pictures of that beautiful warm spring that he and his friends would go swim in and loved? So he would go and do that, and he'd take them there. And he says, sometimes we'd go to state conference in it with all my group of friends. And he says, even general conference. That would have been hours. That would have been, especially in those old cars, of course, yeah. He said it would, probably what does it take us now to get up to Salt Lake from Las Vegas? And it was even 2 hours further than Vegas. So that would be a long trip. I don't know, 10 hours? Anyway, he said one night he had to leave late to go to Ash Springs, and all his friends had already gone except one friend. And his friend's name was Dean Roberts. And because my dad had worked all day and was so exhausted, Dean said he would drive to Ash Springs, which was a couple hours away. And it was really dark, and it was 10 o'clock at night, and his friend was driving that Oldsmobile I just showed you. And they were going 70 miles an hour. So that wasn't too shabby to go 70 miles an hour. So my dad was sound asleep, and this friend was driving. And he said it was a really dark, dark night. And he says, all of a sudden, he goes, I don't know why, but for some reason I opened my eyes. And when I opened my eyes, I saw hundreds of little tiny lights all over on the freeway. And he said, I yelled to Dean, stop. And all he answered with was, why? And he just kept going. And he said by that time, he had plowed into a large herd of sheep that were all bedded down asleep on the road. And he said, well, sheep were going all over us, over the top of the car, to the sides of the car, underneath the car, just like a motorboat plowing through water. He says we were going so fast that we got through the whole herd of sheep before we stopped. He said there were dead sheep everywhere. And he said, that's so sad, but the sheep herder wanted us to pay for his dead sheep, and we wanted him to pay for our Oldsmobile. The fender was all ruined, the grill was ruined, the lights were ruined, but he said they didn't pay us and we didn't pay them. And he said in today's world, with the way suits are and suing people, he said probably the farmer with the sheep on the road would have had the worst end of that deal. But he said Dean Roberts' family couldn't afford to pay them anything. And in that day, they didn't do insurance. So he said his family had to pay to get that car fixed. But he said, we got to go on some of the neatest trips. They went on a trip up to see a friend from Caliente that had moved to Hurricane, Utah, which was 100 miles. And he said, this huge group of girls went up there. And he said, he says, I don't think I've ever known young people that there was such a, he goes, our parents trusted us so much. We were such a good, wholesome group that loved the gospel. And he says, some of the best kids I've ever known. And he said they had such a love for the gospel. They had the highest standards. And he says, he goes, I nor them would have ever thought of doing something wrong. And so our parents gave us so much freedom. And he said, but today it seems like, he goes, we have to worry a little bit more about what's out there for our kids. But he said, and yet our children and our grandchildren are some of the finest and choicest young people, that's you guys, to ever be born on the earth. This is what he said, and will surely accomplish all that is necessary and that has to be done to usher in the millennium and the second coming of the Savior. So you guys help to get to prepare. You are so valiant to prepare for the second coming of our Savior. He said, and I think because I worked so hard, I helped build a house, I purchased our new cars, and my mom and dad trusted me so much because of he helped earn a living for the family. And he said, because I drove the school bus and my dad was the bishop and he'd proven himself to be trustworthy, all the families would trust him to drive their kids. And then just two more stories. So he told about how there was, oh, I forgot to show you the sheep on the road. There are the sheep on the road. This is not the picture he saw because it was pitch dark at night and the sheep were sound asleep. I mean, they were laying down, so you didn't get to see that. But he said that he was made the scoutmaster about his senior year in high school. And he said he was assistant scoutmaster, and the scoutmaster was Bruce Barnum. And he says he was the most special, respected man and loved man of my life. My dad just adored this man. He was so good and so valiant and so faithful. But he said he had this wife that when she was a young girl, she was climbing under a train. So in Caliente, there were so many train tracks that it would take you all day to walk around these trains. And if you could just crawl under them, you didn't have to walk very far. But if you had to go to the end of them, you would have to go so far. It was harder. So sometimes they'd sneak and crawl under. We're never supposed to crawl under a train. It's way too dangerous. And that's what she was doing. So she could go a shortcut. And she was crawling under and the train started rolling and it rolled over her legs and cut both her legs off. And she ended up being my mom's school teacher. My mom loved her so much. But it was the wife of this Bruce Barnum, which was the scoutmaster. And my dad said he loved this man so much, how he treated his wife with so much tenderness and goodness. And he was so much respect and love. And my dad said, I always wanted to treat my wife like that. And he did. My dad treated my mom so beautifully, so loving. But she had these wooden legs and they couldn't get around very well. And he had to carry her and help her all the time. And so my dad just loved the good man that he was. But he said one time we were asked to go to a scout powwow at Lake Mead. And we were going to have all these competitions with all these other scout troops. And they were going to have life-saving and fire building and tying knots and all these great things they were going to learn and make and gather some merit badges. Well, I'm going to show you a picture of Lake Mead, but this is more modern. But that is a picture of Lake Mead. And so they were going to Lake Mead, and they went there, and they had a really fun experience. They had the best time, and he said they took a boat ride to the dam to the Hoover Dam or Boulder Dam. And he said it was all day and they were out in this icy cold and they were just frozen by the time they got back. But he said it was such a once-in-a-lifetime experience. But he said a lot of boys were really sick on that trip. But he said, and they were super cold and they didn't get back till midnight. But he said it was really a beautiful trip. And then after the next day, when my dad was driving, he had asked the school if he could borrow the school bus to take the scouts to this Lake Mead. And they'd okayed it. And my dad drove the school bus with all the scouts. And he said when they were driving home, they passed an airfield and the boys all begged and begged to go on an airplane ride. They'd never been on one. So they went in and talked to the pilot and they all got to go up in this little plane, probably maybe by 2s or 3s, I'm not sure. But he said it was so scary because felt like it was going to fall apart at any time. But anyway, they were all safe. They got back in the bus they were driving. And he said, we were driving along at a pretty fast rate when a 2-door cloth-topped car, so not metal on the top, but a cloth coupe went driving past, and it was going really too fast and weaving in and out. And he said all of a sudden we came around the corner in that car. They watched it careen and fall off a cliff into a big wash or a big ditch. And he said they all they all jumped out of the bus. All of the scouts ran down to the car, and he said they were trying to lift it off. And he said we weren't prepared for what we saw. He said there were 2 young girls in there and they were in the worst condition. It was terrible. Both of them were unconscious and they had bones sticking out. They were just badly cut up and bleeding, and they were in terrible, terrible shape. And these scouts it was so upsetting for them, but they knew they had to help. And so they pitched in and they all lifted that car off the girls. Then they were able to lift the girls, and the girls never came to, but they lifted them up to the roadway, and then another car stopped and said, we're going to ride into Las Vegas and make a phone call for an ambulance for you. So back in those days, you didn't have cell phones to call for an ambulance. You had to drive to a town and get a phone to call. So that was a really scary time for them. And he said, we don't know if they ever lived or died. We never got to hear, but the ambulance finally got there and they were able to stay with them and put blankets on them and take care of them until the ambulance got there. But they never were conscious at the scene. He said it really helped him want to be the most safest driver after what he saw. Then he says one last story. This story is, he says on a more positive note. And he said he went with Aquila, who's my uncle. Isn't that a great name, Aquila? And Don, my other uncle, which was my mom's brother, and Abe and Keith. And he said, we went to Kershaw, which was a beautiful park by their town that they would often go to. And they hiked up a canyon for several miles. That was quite a long ways to go up. And they went past an old abandoned railroad tracks and guard house and this old abandoned railroad tracks. And he said, and then we saw at the top of this big, big mountain or hill, they saw a rock as big as a house. And this rock was just kind of perched on the edge. And they were like, if we worked on that and dug, and then pried and pried, I wonder if we can get this massive rock to roll down the hill and watch this amazing thing. So they worked and worked. And he said he thought it weighed between 50 and 100 tons. A ton is 2,000 pounds. So here, I'm just showing you a picture that isn't the rock, but it'd be really huge like this. And he said they worked a long time on it. And he said it was as big as a house, and it looked like with a little help, we could get it to start rolling down the hill. So we began to dig the dirt from under the bottom edge of it, keeping a sharp eye. They were making sure it didn't move, which I thought that sounded super dangerous to be underneath it. But they were dirt working underneath it because I can imagine it rolling on them. But he said it finally started to move a little, so they got out from behind it, put a big stick and pried it. And he said they were able to finally get it to go. And after one supreme effort, he said, it started rolling. And he said it's went several miles, and it tore out large trees. And it acted like they were little sticks, little matchsticks, just flying over the big trees and tearing out an abandoned railroad bridge and tracks. And that boulder destroyed everything in its path. It just wiped everything out. He says, and I'm thinking in my mind, that's terrible. I would have felt horrible. He says, no, this is what he thought. Wow, what an exciting sight for boys who love to roll rocks down mountains as much as we did. Wow, that was an exciting sight. I don't know if any rocks that large have ever been rolled down a mountain by men or boys. But one thing I'm sure of, and that is that there have never been many of them that were equal in size and went that distance that we boys rolled off that mountain that day. I wish I had a video of it, he said. I think it could have really had a great place in a James Bond movie. And so I thought that was really cute. He thought that was an amazing experience. And he had so many amazing experiences, and I love his stories, and I hope you're enjoying them too. I'm learning a lot about my dad that I didn't know all these stories. Some of them I knew, but it's super fun getting to hear them and read them and study them and look for pictures. So it's more in my head. Like these pictures, I've tried to find pictures from that year and that model of car and truck. And so we're kind of getting a glimpse back in history. So this is your history lesson for this week. You're learning a lot of good things during the COVID. You're learning a lot of good things for history. So you can tell your teacher someday. Anyway, I love you guys. Stay safe.